So you're probably all at least somewhat familiar with the idea of the war on drugs. Okay, this government effort to try to end drug use, end all the evils of drugs, the debilitating effects on health and families and communities, and the war on drugs tends to have been framed as this very kind of positive thing. The government is trying to help people, um, but that may not be entirely the case, and certainly not the outcome. Um, we can see here this graph that's looking at crime rates. It's starting to rise quite a bit in the 60s, kind of peaking in the 90s, starting to go down. There are different kind of questions that people would ask about, why did we have these increased crime rates? Why is crime increasing so much over these decades? Some people claim that because of the baby boom, and after the World War II, that then you had all these young men more likely to engage in criminal activity. So, that's why you had these, ideas about a lot of people are moving out of the suburbs. You have urban decay, that's creating crime. People are trying to kind of figure out. But a big part of why we have this rise in crime is because of the war on drugs. If we're supposed to be learning from our history, we should know that prohibition does not work. Prohibition, when it was against alcohol, didn't work. And it doesn't really work when the problem is drugs either. The prohibition ended up leading to, more crime. Because so many people were breaking the laws. It was also so profitable. You have the rise of organized crime. So really just doesn't work. We also have to be thinking about kind of some of the reasons behind this actual war on drugs. I mean, we can see that it has this increase in crime. The war on drugs started under the Nixon administration, first with the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Prevention and Control Act, and then the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, being formed. It later came to light what a lot of people had kind of been saying when John Ehrlichman came out and kind of admitted. He says the Nixon campaign in '68 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night in the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Okay, I don't know if you heard all the cat crying in the background, if it got picked up on this mic or not, but I had to stop to go let the cat into my room since he is crying pitifully. He really wants to help me make this PowerPoint. So anyway, the Nixon is very much wanting to target black people. This is not about, drugs are bad, they're ruining communities, they have these negative effects on health and well-being, and I mean, that's something that can help kind of win the public over. But the real reason is to target the anti-war left and black people. And these are also groups that are much more likely to be criticizing Nixon, to be voting Democrat. And so that's a lot of the real reasons behind the war on drugs, is trying to associate drug use with these particular populations so that they can be locked up and put in prison. We saw how the courts and the prisons were used very much to try to silence, activists with Angela Davis and Mumia and Assata Shakur and others. And this is kind of an additional effort to do this, right? To be vilifying African Americans, vilifying black leaders, showing that their communities are kind of rotten and corrupt and wrong. And so therefore heavy, police presences there are necessary. And to say, oh, it's not that we are, putting this police pressure onto activists. We're putting this police pressure onto criminals who are using drugs and need to be taken off the streets. This graph here shows the money spent on the war on drugs. You can see $1.5 trillion by 2010. The blue line here that, wavers a little but stays pretty steady is the U.S. drug addiction rate. So the drug addiction rate really is not changing at all. The money being spent is a lot. Here's another. This one is saying $1 trillion. I'm not totally sure that what they're not taking into account or what year this goes up to. But you can see the different kinds of places where the money is going to. Of that kind of breakdown. So it's a lot of money and it's not getting results unless you consider mass incarceration and the large numbers of people in prison as the result that you want. Because if you don't really care so much about stopping people from using drugs, and you're more concerned about locking Black people up, well, then it's a resounding success. We get this real dramatic increase in America's prison population, largely from the war on drugs, although the war on drugs kind of pushes this even further. So it's not that everyone in prison is there because of drug use, although you have other criminal activities that are more likely once people are engaged in the selling, the distribution, the use of drugs. In 1970, our prison population was 196,429. By 1980, it's 315,974. Just one decade, and you can see how it is drastically increasing. You have a 700% growth in our prison system from 1970 to 2005. That's a huge amount. We have 25% of the total world's prison population, but we're only 5% of the world's population. So if all things were equal, we're 5% of the world's population, we would expect 5% of the world's prison population. Maybe we want to be better than the rest of the world. We want to say we have lower prison rates. We need less than 5% of the world's prison population. Instead, we're at 25%. 49% of the U.S. federal prison population is due to the war on drugs. That's the federal prison population. And this costs $80 billion a year in federal, state, and local tax dollars. So think about what $80 billion a year could go to for, other things that might be more beneficial than locking people up into prisons. This is showing incarceration rates. So this is the number of people per 100,000 who are in prison, right? In the United States, for every 100,000 people we have, 716 are in prison. The next in this list is the United Kingdom. And these are the founding NATO members. So the kind of countries that we'd probably want to compare ourselves to. We'd want to be on par with. And you can see that there are some similarities. I mean, Norway is all the way down at 72, so the UK is twice that, but that they are much more kind of similar. The United States is far outside of this. If we do another comparison, we can see the closest is Russia. Then there's Georgia, Belarus, Latvia, Ukraine. So we have by far the most people locked up into prisons. We can see the initial rise in the federal prisoner population, starting with prohibition. Nixon then declares his war on drugs. It's not really until the 90s, though, under Clinton, that we get even more. And a lot of this will be kind of reviewed and gone into a bit more depth in the movie 13th that I'm having you guys watch, which is does a really great job at kind of tracing these issues and looking at how the prison system is really targeting African Americans. So we get this real, here it's saying racial bias, racism in who gets arrested. So black people are 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people, despite reporting virtually the same use rate. So that means that black and white folks use pot at pretty much the same rates, roughly, but black folks are 3.7 times more likely to be arrested. And this comes down to these assumptions of criminality. And like I said, the movie 13th will do a really great job at kind of tracing this. But it's something that arises after the end of the Civil War. To be saying black people are criminals, right? Black people should be lynched because obviously they're criminals. We don't even need to have a trial. We don't need to prove anything. Obviously they are. It's this assumption of criminality, assumption of violence, assumption that they're up to no good, and need to be kind of, violently repressed to prevent them from, destroying society, threatening white people, especially threatening white women. And so cops are far more likely to be suspicious of African Americans because there is this whole assumption of criminality that develops within our society. Here we can see this is from 2013 numbers. They asked both whites and blacks in the United States about, illicit crime or illicit drug use, right, in the past month. 9.5% of whites said they had used drugs, 10.5% of blacks said they had. So very similar numbers, off by a very small amount. But when we look at the drug-related arrests per 100,000 residents, you have 879 black folks for every 100,000 arrested, and 332 white folks for every 100,000 whites arrested. So that means that you are having blacks are far more likely to be arrested for using drugs, even though they're using them at pretty much the same rates as whites. Very little difference there. But they're more likely to be stopped, to be kind of suspected of criminal activity, whereas white folks are more likely to be given some of the benefit of the doubt, not as much of this kind of immediate assumption that they are up to no good. Now, here's some other numbers. Nearly 9 out of every 10 drug-related cases that led to prison sentences involved a black defendant. Right. So, again, African Americans far, far more likely to be first, charged, right, arrested by police, charged with the crime, and then found guilty. If we're looking at the demographics for the prison population, these are numbers from 2012. Here we can see, right, the white population, and then the percentage of incarcerated population. So whites are much less likely, even though they are making up a majority of the population. African Americans, who make up somewhere around 13-14% of the population, are making up almost 40% of the prison population here. You can see the problem isn't quite as bad for Hispanics, but it is a problem there as well. So African Americans are far, far more likely to end up in prison. Now, some people will bring up issues of poverty, and people who are living in poverty are more likely to commit crimes. So they're saying, well, black people are, tend to be more struggling with poverty, would be more likely to commit crimes. But they've actually done studies that find that black children of wealthy parents are more likely to end up in prison than white children in poor families. So that idea of, even kind of when we're adjusting for levels of kind of class and wealth and those issues, show that that's not the entire picture. That rich black folks are much more likely to end up in prison. This is another way to be looking at the U.S. incarceration rates by race. So for every 100,000 black people, 2,207 are in prison. For every 100,000 white people, only 380 are in prison. So just how drastically different the numbers are here, with Latinos kind of in the middle. We can also see these problems in terms of execution. Right, here is showing U.S. population, but there's almost as many black people as whites awaiting execution, even though, again, black folks make up way, 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 way less of the population than whites, right? Whites are here a little over 60%. Blacks are here at about 12, 13, or about 13 to 14% now, probably. Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the exact numbers, but probably by the next census, it'll be about 14% of the population will be black. So you can see that black folks are disproportionately on death row. Also, when we look at serving life without parole, blacks are far, far more likely to be serving life without parole. They make up about 55, I'd say it's a bit more than 55% of all the inmates serving life without parole. Even though, again, they're about 13 to 14% of the entire U.S. population. And these numbers are looking at Massachusetts, because although in Massachusetts we tend to be a bit more kind of progressive than other parts of the country, we shouldn't kind of let that lull ourselves into this false sense that everything's fine here. Because for every 100,000 white folks, 241 are in prison, and every 100,000 black folks, 1,502 are in prison. So we also see this real disproportionate numbers of black folks here in our state of Massachusetts ending up in prison, right? Because of these kind of assumptions of guilt and criminality that make them far more likely to be kind of harassed by police, arrested, found guilty, charged for longer periods. This ends up resulting in black folks having a far higher likelihood of imprisonment, right? Men, in general, all men, have about a 1 in 9 chance of being in prison. White men, it's a 1 in 17 chance of being in prison. For black men, it's 1 in 3. Again, 1 in 3 black men will spend some time in prison. 1 in 3. That's just a horrifically large number. Women are much less likely to end up in prison. White women, it's only 1 in 111. But for black women, it's 1 in 18. 1 in 18 black women will end up in prison. So these are the problems with mass incarceration and with these kind of assumptions of criminality. And the assumptions of criminality lead to not only much higher incarceration rates, but also much higher rates of police brutality and of killings by police, which are some of the big things that I'm going to have you guys looking at this week.